Hello and welcome to a special spooky video for Halloween. Basically, I have been watching the new Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, which is out on Netflix now, and one of the early episodes involves a trial and there's a lot of different legal themes. So I thought it would be quite fun just to have a look at some of those legal themes and see if they would maybe be decided the same way in English law. Now, I'm probably not the target audience for Sabrina the Teenage Witch, but certainly as a 90s kid, I grew up watching Sabrina, the original version, on CITV after schools. It was originally based on the Archie comics from the 1970s, and it was a really good show. I probably wasn't the target audience, but I enjoyed it anyway. The new Netflix show is really good as well, though, although one of the main characters from the 90s show isn't carried over, and that is Salem, who is the talking cat. And as you can see from the quote there, he was quite a sassy character. So it's a shame that he didn't get carried over, but never mind. We'll deal with what we've got, which is the Trial of Sabrina Spellman, which is the episode name that we're going to be dealing with. And the guy that you can see there in the main part of the picture is the devil's representative on Earth, who is the prosecutor in this case. One of the other main characters is a guy called Daniel Webster, and he is essentially a lawyer as well, and is actually based on a US senator who is called Daniel Webster, and he was very famous because he sort of gave a lot of really good speeches and is considered to be one of the finest orators of all time. But the real reason he's included is because of his short story that was published, which was called The Devil and Daniel Webster. The picture you can see there is from a still from the 1941 film of the same name based on the short story. And essentially what happens here is that a guy sells his soul to the devil, and then when the devil comes to collect his prize, there is a trial. Daniel Webster represents the farmer who has sold his soul and wins the case on the basis that as an American citizen, the farmer shouldn't be subject to a foreign prince, which has a lot of undertones about the revolution against the British and Declaration of Independence, but never mind. Anyway, even if you're not familiar with the story, you might be familiar with the general idea because it was the basis for the Simpsons episode, the Treehouse of Horror #4, and it's very similar, but Homer Simpson in this episode sells his soul for a donut, which it's a really good episode. You should probably check it out if you do get a chance. Anyway, back to Sabrina the Teenage Witch, rather than going off on tangents about The Simpsons. Sabrina is brought up on trial for a breach of promise. And the promise that she's broken is that she's promised to sign the devil's book and sign her soul away in return for various powers, such as flying and other things to do with witchcraft. She's promised that she was going to sign it, and then at the last minute she changes her mind and decides not to sign it, so she is brought up on trial for that reason. And this made me think a lot about the idea of promissory estoppel, which is to do with contract law. And so to establish promissory estoppel in English law, you need three elements. So there has to be an unequivocal promise by words or conduct. So Sabrina has promised to sign her name in the Black Book. Secondly, there's a change in position of the promisee, which in this case is the devil himself, as a result of that promise. And we certainly have that because Sabrina is promised a place in the Academy of Unseen Arts, and there's various arrangements that are made for that, so we do have that change in position as well. And finally, there's inequity or unfairness if the promisor Sabrina goes back on her promise, and clearly there is a certain element of unfairness. So actually under English law it's looking pretty good for the devil at this stage, but there was another part of this episode that does favour Sabrina, and this is the idea of misrepresentation, because although Sabrina has promised this, the religion of Satanism and signing her name in the Black Book is kind of underrepresented. It's sort of presented as a bit of a formality, and the idea of Satanism itself is that it's not really based on evil, but rather free will. And it turns out that that's not the case at all, and that Sabrina would be signing over everything and would have to obey orders from the devil himself if she were to sign the book. And so we can look at this definition of misrepresentation from Section 1 of the Misrepresentation Act 1967, and it's where a person enters into a contract and if there is a misrepresentation, they're entitled to rescind that contract, which basically would restore the parties back to their original position. So this would certainly favour Sabrina in this particular situation, but unfortunately there's a lot about the trial itself that sort of goes against her. Some of the other arguments, for example, include that the prosecutor argues that this is kind of like a marriage that needs to be consummated, which, to be honest, is a little bit of a weird part of the episode and is a bit probably too close to the Me Too movement. In any case, under English law, things like marital rape are obviously illegal, and that was decided in the controversial case of the Crown against R in 1991. Controversial not obviously because of the result, but because of the idea of retrospectivity in the law. It's quite an interesting case. So one of the other things that goes against Sabrina in terms of the actual trial setting itself is that in the Devil's Court you are not innocent until proven guilty, you are guilty until proven innocent. And for me this was quite reminiscent of some of the sort of show trials that you would have had in Soviet Russia. And the aim of these trials is not as like a sort of investigation where you're trying to find the truth or trying to achieve some sense of justice, but rather just to establish the authority of the regime. And similarly in this case, we're just really trying to establish the authority of the devil. There's not really much interest in justice, so it's probably a little bit unfair, but that's the way it works. So one of the ways that they try and get out of this unfair trial is that one is entitled to a jury of one's peers. Now, in the human realm, this is fairly easy to establish because, you know, this could just be anyone off the street who can end up being as part of a jury trial if it goes to, say, a Crown Court. However, in this episode, we're obviously dealing with mortals and witches. And so there's a bit of a question about whether Sabrina is a mortal or a witch. And so we have to find out whether Sabrina has the mark of a witch on her. And this leads to a really weird scene where she's sort of in the woods with her boyfriend, and rather than using a mirror to actually check whether she's got a witch's mark, she decides to basically just strip off in front of her boyfriend and get him to do a sort of full body check, which was probably a bit unnecessary, to be honest, but there we go. So it turns out that Sabrina doesn't appear to have a witch's mark and therefore is a mortal, and therefore a jury of her peers would not be sort of the infernal three who are meant to be judging the case, but rather humans instead. So that was one of the key arguments. However, the way that the case is won in the end is based on sort of contract law, and it turns out in the episode that the contract had actually been signed with the devil while Sabrina was still an infant. And so this raised the question about whether you can sign a contract on behalf of a baby. And technically someone with parental responsibility can do this, although the child can then decide to rescind the contract before they come of age. And we know in this episode that Sabrina has just turned 16, because that's the whole idea about her having this baptism at the age of 16. So she would actually be able to rescind it. So that earlier contract doesn't really matter. But the way she actually wins the case in the end is that it's revealed by Aunt Hilda, who we see on this slide here, that the day before that contract was signed with the devil, she was actually baptized. Sabrina was baptized in a Roman Catholic service, and so that earlier contract takes precedent over the later contract, because it's obviously for the same item. Now, if it was with the same party, it would be possible to rescind the earlier contract, but I think in this circumstance, the earlier contract, which is the baptism, secures Sabrina's soul before the devil is able to take it by having her name signed in the Black Book. So the devil obviously knows at this stage that he's onto a losing thing, and so there is a deal that's done with the devil. And so rather than Sabrina having to burn in hell for eternity, as sort of was meant to be her punishment if she lost the case, the devil decides to offer a deal whereby Sabrina would retain her mortality but would still have to go to the Academy of Unseen Arts and learn all about becoming a witch. So this is represented as sort of dual citizenship. I'm not really quite sure it works like that, but it's quite interesting. The idea of a deal with the prosecution is something that's quite familiar in criminal trials nowadays and is being increasingly used. So rather than reaching a final guilty or innocent verdict, the person would normally plead guilty and then get a lesser sentence. And it kind of feels that's a little bit what's going on here. Well, anyway, that's all I've got to say about the episode. I hope you enjoyed the video. Do all the like, comment, subscribe thing. And I hope you have a happy Halloween.